When it comes to Russia's war against Ukraine, right now is a very satisfying time to be an analyst of this war. Because right now we are seeing several things happening that we have been told for years were simply impossible and would never happen. I won't list all of them in this video. I have several videos talking about a lot of different things that are going on. But specifically in this video, I wanted to focus on one thing that everybody told us for sure would never happen, which is that Ukraine would never be able to actually retake Crimea from Russian hands. If you're not familiar with Crimea, Crimea is this peninsula jutting off the bottom of Ukraine into the Black Sea, and Crimea is actually the first piece of Ukrainian territory that Russia took all the way back in 2014, long before their full-scale invasion. And Ukraine has always said, ever since Russia invaded them in their full-scale invasion, that they would ultimately get all of their land back, including not just eastern Ukraine that Russia more recently took from them, but also the Crimean Peninsula. And this is one of those things that, as I said, people have said is simply impossible, even a lot of pro-Ukraine people. And a lot of political figures, whether they be European or famously the US vice president and the US president at times, have said it would simply be impossible for Ukraine to ever actually achieve this objective. And while Ukraine hasn't taken Crimea back now, what is very fascinating is we are beginning to see a plan that I've talked about for a long time actually be executed with increased vigor. Where I have talked about the fact that Crimea is difficult to take because there are a few access points onto the peninsula, but that those same factors also make the peninsula extremely vulnerable to siege and extremely vulnerable to tactics where Ukraine could basically lock the peninsula off from contact to the rest of Russia and slowly over time force Russians to leave the peninsula. That plan is no longer theory. It is actually happening as the siege of Crimea has begun a new phase. The siege of Crimea started early on in the war. Ukraine achieved a lot of objectives and let it sit still for a while. But now it appears that the siege of Crimea has reached a new phase where it seems that Ukraine is actively trying to get the Russians who are living on Crimea, who moved there after Russia stole this territory from Ukraine. Ukraine is actually trying to get these Russians to leave the peninsula as soon as possible by making life there simply not worth living. I'm constantly connecting to different public Wi-Fi networks and bouncing between devices when I work on my videos. And every time I connect to a new public Wi-Fi network, whether that's at a coffee shop, airport, or hotel, I'm potentially putting sensitive information at risk. That's because public Wi-Fi traffic often isn't encrypted, and that means it's surprisingly easy for someone on the same network to intercept your data, including passwords and financial details. For that reason, I use Private Internet Access, the sponsor of today's video. Private Internet Access is a VPN that lets me encrypt my information wherever I am, and it also masks my location, so I don't have to worry about people snooping on my personal details when I log into Wi-Fi in public spaces. But the best part about this might be that it also comes with a lot of special perks, especially if I'm traveling internationally. For example, if I'm outside the US, since Private Internet Access masks my location, I can access my streaming accounts the same way I would back home. On the flip side of that, I can also log into another country's servers while I'm at home to unlock unique shows that I wouldn't otherwise have access to here in the US. So for example, I could log in from Australia right now to watch the Lord of the Rings series on Netflix, which isn't currently available in my home country. The best part is that Private Internet Access covers all of my devices at once on a single subscription, whether that be Windows, Mac, iOS, Android, or Linux. If you want to try out Private Internet Access for yourself, you can actually get a great deal and get started right now by using my link to get 83% off plus 4 extra months free. That comes down to less than $2.03 per month. To get started, just click the link in the description or scan the QR code on screen. When it comes to Crimea, there are a lot of very important things that have happened recently. And by recently, I mean literally within the past week or so. And there are other things that have also happened within the past couple of months that play into the things that have happened recently and help explain what's going on. And when we look at all of these things together, we realize that Ukraine really is working towards a cohesive strategy, which appears to be that siege strategy that I already mentioned. So first and foremost, there's obviously the famous event going on in Crimea right now, which is that their oil terminal has been on fire for several days. And this is a really big deal because when we see this oil terminal on fire for several days, it means that what is burning up is some of the few oil stocks that sit on Crimea right now. Crimea has famously been experiencing the same gasoline shortages as the rest of Russia, except in Crimea, it's been one of the worst hit territories in all of Russia. And already gasoline has been massively rationed on Crimea, and basically there's just not enough to go around. With this already happening, the remaining oil and gasoline that still exists on the peninsula is literally burning up before our eyes, and that is obviously going to be a very big deal. However, even more than the existing stocks burning up, what is really significant here is that the oil terminal itself seems to be damaged, which means Crimea's main way of getting gasoline onto the peninsula has been removed. So not only are they losing the stuff they had, but they're going to have a hard time replacing it. And that's not just because this oil terminal is being destroyed, but also because their alternative routes to get supplies have been severely hampered for several months. A couple months back, Ukraine destroyed a Russian train in the middle of Ukrainian occupied territory. And it's been several months now, and Russia has not been able to remove this train and get new supplies running. And that's because it exists so close to the front lines that anybody trying to send heavy equipment there to, remove the destroyed train is going to get attacked and destroyed by Ukrainian drones. And this goes for any personnel that try to clear the area too. So effectively, this artery has been cut off from supplying Crimea. And that is a very big deal in and of itself, because this had become the main artery used to supply Crimea. There's basically two major ways onto Crimea. One is these rail bridges, and another is the Kerch Strait Bridge to the east. But for a long time, Russia has basically ceased transporting expensive material, especially military equipment, but also energy, over this Kerch Strait Bridge, because by Russia's own logic, not Ukrainian logic, but Russia's own logic, the Kerch Strait Bridge was too vulnerable to being destroyed at any time to risk, high priority, expensive equipment going over that. By taking out this rail line, Ukraine has basically brought Russia's options to near zero, especially with these terminals now being taken out as well. Russia could continue to choose to ship things over the Kerch Strait Bridge, but that stuff would be vulnerable. They're having to do that now, but Ukraine can potentially destroy that. We'll get back to it. Russia can also send things via ship to Crimea, but Ukraine has demonstrated for a long time that they're able to destroy Russian ferries rather easily, and so that hasn't been a viable option for Russia for some time. And so essentially the only viable option for Russia, other than these two things, is to take the supplies that would have been traveling to Crimea via rail and to get it there via truck instead, to divert a lot of trucks down along roads that are far enough away from the Ukrainian front line to not be threatened, and get that supplies onto Crimea that way. This is a dilemma for Russia because none of these options are good. Every option that they choose means something very bad could happen to them. And with the trucks, the dilemma is that the more trucks in this region that they use to supply Crimea is less trucks that they can use to actually supply their frontline troops, which might be part of the reason that Russia has really struggled to have offensives, especially for the past several months, because there's just not enough trucks to supply both Crimea and the frontline troops. Russia, of course, though, is always going to choose to supply Crimea over the frontline troops because the frontline troops are not so much in the media spotlight. They're not allowed to have cameras, things like that. Whereas the citizens in Crimea are those average Russian citizens that Russia wants to demonstrate are completely safe in order to keep support for their war effort strong. And so Russia has essentially been forced to do two things. They've been forced to take supplies that would have gone to their frontline troops or trucks that would have delivered supplies to their frontline troops and divert those to supplying Crimea to keep it happy enough to stay within the Russian orbit. But they've also been forced to use the increasingly precarious Kerch Strait Bridge. Now, when you take all of these separate pieces together and you combine it with the fact that lately Ukraine has been increasing their strikes on Russian air defense systems on the Crimean Peninsula, you realize that what's happening is very much not just business as usual when it comes to Crimea, but what is happening is an actual change in Ukrainian strategy, an actual escalation that to me shows they are probably preparing for the next phase of their war. What I'm talking about here is that early on in the war, Ukraine did similar things like this to siege Crimea, and they were very successful. For example, they took out Russian air defense systems, they took out Russian ships to the point that Russia had to actually relocate the Black Sea Fleet off of Crimea for the most part and get them to other parts of the Black Sea out of range of Ukraine, which was a real bummer for Russia because really the whole point of having Crimea strategically was to have it as a base for the Black Sea fleet. And we saw Ukraine also doing initial strikes on the Kerch Strait Bridge, demonstrating that they could take out sections of the bridge. But notably, they never fully finished any of these strategies. They sort of softened up Crimea as a target, and then they largely left it alone for quite a while, with one exception. What Ukraine did after that initial phase was every once in a while, they would come back and they would do these big bursts where they would destroy a bunch of Russian air defense all over Crimea. And what Russia would do every single time, like clockwork, is they would repair these expensive air defense systems, even though they weren't being very effective. I think that Ukraine realized that Russia was always going to replace destroyed military equipment on Crimea because Russia had to show the people on Crimea that they were militarily there to protect them, that they were there to be the sovereign country here. Russia's in charge, not Ukraine. And so what Ukraine was doing over years, which is what they've done, I've argued, in a lot of other parts of Russia as well, was they were bleeding Russia dry of different supplies. Every air defense system that they took out in Crimea, which in many cases was easier to target than air defense systems in other parts of Russia or other parts of the front line, was an air defense system that when it was replaced was diverting air defense from the rest of Russia. And so Ukraine for a long time used Crimea as kind of a way to bait Russia into getting more military equipment vulnerable where it could be easily destroyed by Ukraine, ramping up the rate of attrition across Crimea, but also across the rest of the front line. What we're seeing now, though, is a change in strategy where Ukraine seems to be moving from this slow burn attrition to actually taking different targets offline. I've argued that this is what they're doing, for example, with Russian oil refineries, where for a long time they had sporadic strikes all across Russia, but now they're hitting the same facilities over and over and over and over again. Many facilities they've hit 5 times or more, showing that they are specifically trying to take those refineries offline, probably because they've been given enough time in the war to actually kind of bleed Russia dry of parts and repair personnel, and now they're actually trying to create sustained, lasting impacts. We take that same logic and we see what's happening to Crimea now, and it appears that Ukraine is actively trying to move Crimea into the next phase, which is a more extreme siege phase, where they are actually actively going to try to convince the Russians on Crimea to leave the peninsula as soon as possible. Now, when I use the word siege, I do have to clarify what I mean. I'm not talking about that classic medieval type siege where everybody gets stuck in the castle, the army surrounds it, and nobody's allowed to leave. And so everybody essentially dies of starvation eventually. They can't get food, they can't get water. That's not what Ukraine is doing. That's a war crime. Ukraine's siege of Crimea is different. Ukraine has demonstrated that they can destroy the Kerch Strait Bridge, which is the safest path back to Russia, but they have notably not destroyed it. And so as Ukraine begins a siege of Crimea, this is an economic siege. It's a siege against the military assets, but they are leaving an escape route open where anybody can get out of Crimea. They do not have to make the choice of stay in Crimea and starve to death or leave the city walls and get killed by the military. They simply have to make the choice to leave Crimea because there is no opportunity available to them. With this in mind, Ukraine has always had several options when it comes to sieging Crimea. For example, the main canal that provides water to Crimea comes down from the Ukrainian mainland, and Ukraine has always held the option of cutting off that canal and preventing agriculture from happening in Crimea. This isn't drinking water, it's the agricultural water. They're not attacking the private citizens' health. They're attacking the ability of the peninsula to do industry. And even with this in mind, in Crimea right now, there is a severe water shortage and a lot of agriculture on the peninsula has essentially ceased. Now, on top of this, what we're seeing is this attack on the energy. And energy is, of course, the fiber of daily life. You can't do anything in the modern world without energy. You can't drive a vehicle. You can't run a generator. You can't have electricity, etc., 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 etc. So Ukraine, what they are doing with all these different strategies, especially by taking out these transport arteries, is they are making Crimea a place that is not viable to live and a place that is not viable for Russia to defend in the long term without having to face excessive costs. Because again, Ukraine a long time ago portrayed that they have drone supremacy over Crimea, and they proved that they have drone supremacy over Crimea and they can hit any target within Crimea basically anytime they want. Now, on top of all of this, not only is Ukraine making Crimea not a viable place to live, but they are also trying to make the option of leaving Crimea a limited time opportunity, at least in the minds of the people there. I think this is why, for example, Ukraine has struck the Kerch Strait Bridge several different times, and they've demonstrated that they can hit it in several different ways, but they've never actually taken it offline. Ukraine wants to constantly be reminding the people who live in Crimea that they can be cut off from their opportunity to get out of there. And increasingly, we see Ukraine talking about this lately, where, we've seen Ukrainian official accounts share pictures of the Kerch Strait Bridge on social media, kind of sending ominous messages. And we've also seen Ukraine announce the release of the Flamingo missile, and they're also in discussions with the United States to get Tomahawk missiles, both of which could be viable options to potentially actually destroy the Kerch Strait Bridge and basically isolate the people of Crimea. I don't think Ukraine's plan, though, is actually to destroy the bridge. I think Ukraine's plan is to make the people in Crimea terrified enough that the bridge will be destroyed, that they look at how bad life is getting there, and they get out while they can. And this is really, if true, a brilliant strategy by Ukraine, perhaps one of the most brilliant things we've seen from them, because it shows how they are, in both a military but also in a very diplomatic way, solving the biggest problem of Crimea that was always going to exist, which is that even if you can take Crimea militarily, because Russia moved so many Russian citizens onto Crimea after they annexed it, a lot of who are going to be seen in the international community as innocent people, it would be very difficult for Ukraine to actually reoccupy this land without Russia creating a propaganda firestorm in the international world. So for Ukraine to ultimately successfully retake Crimea, they need to achieve the military objective, yes, but they also need a viable way to get the transplanted Russian population that doesn't belong there because they're on stolen land to go back to Russia where they came from, and to give them a way to do that that is safe, and ideally a way for them to do that where they are making the choice to do that. They're not being forced to go. In all of this, we see that Ukraine has potentially flipped a switch from just having that as a possibility sometime in the future to maybe now actively pursuing this. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to be concluded tomorrow. It will still take a long time. But in the words of Winston Churchill, and I've said this before, this may not be the end. It may not even be the beginning of the end, but it is probably at least the end of the beginning. Now, as I said, this is especially interesting because this is something that people from the very beginning have always said is impossible. But Ukraine has now proved that it is indeed possible, and it's satisfying for me because it is just one of many predictions that I've made that people have told me over and over again that I'm wrong, that are now turning out to probably be true, and things are moving in the exact direction that I predicted. I hate to humble brag, but I also sometimes have to throw that kind of stuff out there to establish the credibility of the channel so that I'm not just blowing smoke. Pretty much everything I've predicted on this channel has actually happened or is in the process of happening. And that's because I put a lot of work into my analysis. I don't bring political bias into it. I just try to logically connect the facts and see what leads to the next thing and what actually appears to be happening, not just what I hope will happen or what seems incredible. If you do appreciate that type of analysis, follow the channel. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Those things help the channel a lot. They're completely free and they only take a couple of seconds. But if you really, really like this channel, if you've been watching for a long time, I would also ask you to consider becoming a patron or a YouTube channel member. Those are just ways to support the channel, keep content like this coming, keep up my ability to continue this consistent research, hopefully all the way through the end of the war. If you want to do that, there's a number of links in the description by which you can support the channel. Thank you so much to all of my supporters. It really does mean a lot. You really do make this happen. With that in mind, I'll see you on the next one.